Have you ever noticed that, even trying to do the right thing, there is a voice inside your mind that never shuts up, and often distances you from God without anyone seeing? It is as if, in silence, insistent thoughts arise, creating doubts, fears, and memories that seem to control your emotions. And the more you try to ignore it, the more they come back, like an echo that doesn't dissolve. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, everything gets more intense. Time slows down, the mind races, and the heart feels the weight of something it cannot explain. An invisible cycle repeats itself. You think, feel, react, and then he wonders why he continues to be trapped in the same internal conflicts. What few realize is that this is not just an emotional struggle. There is something deeper going on, something that most have never been taught to see. The Bible reveals that the mind is a field where real spiritual battles are being fought, and that every thought carries a direction. There is a hidden key in all this, a way to interrupt this cycle, something that has always been accessible but rarely understood. It is not something complicated nor distant. It's closer than it seems, but it remains invisible to those who have never been taught to look the right way. What if I told you that there is a way to silence this inner chaos? Not by erasing thoughts, but by completely transforming how they act within you. A change that does not begin outside, but inside, where no one sees, but where everything is decided. There is a way to align your mind with God so deeply that what once dominated you begins to lose strength. There is a spiritual code, simple at first glance, but powerful in its essence. A principle taught by Jesus and lived by men who faced their own conflicts and won. Something that can transform your mind from a battlefield to a place of peace. If you stay until the end, you will understand how to apply this in your life in a practical and real way. And what begins to change within you can still be felt today. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12:2. Now, as you move forward, you will realize that none of this is by chance. Each part of this path is built to show you how thoughts can be transformed, how the mind can be purified, and how it is possible to live with more peace, clarity, and spiritual direction. Biblical stories will reveal how ordinary people overcame deep internal battles and found strength in God when all seemed lost. And as you continue, it may feel as if something inside you is being adjusted, as if these words achieve exactly what you are living today. There is a purpose in this. And if this message has already started to touch your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this way you help this word to reach other people who also need to find this transformation. There is a place where it all begins, but almost no one pays attention to it. Before any decision, before any attitude, even before any word is spoken, there is a thought. And that's exactly where the biggest battle of your life happens. It is not visible, it does not make noise, no one around you notices, but inside your mind there is a constant confrontation that defines the course of your walk with God. The most impressive thing is that this battle does not begin with wrong actions, but with seemingly small, almost innocent ideas that are silently installed. It was like this from the beginning. In the Garden of Eden, Eve did not fall because she was forced, but because a thought was planted. The serpent did not scream, did not force, did not push. She just whispered a question. Is that how God said? And at that moment, something changed. Doubt entered. And when doubt creeps in, it begins to distort what was once clear. What God had spoken ceased to be an absolute truth and began to be questioned within her mind. That was the real beginning of the fall, not the act of eating the fruit, but the instant the thought was accepted. And this continues to happen today in an even more subtle way. How many times thoughts arise within you, questioning your faith, your worth, your purpose? How many times do negative ideas appear as if they were your own, when in fact they are just trying to take you away from what God has already stated about you? The problem is that when we don't realize this, we begin to treat these thoughts as truths. And what you believe, even if it's a lie, begins to shape your emotions, your choices, and ultimately your destiny. The mind then becomes a field where seeds are sown all the time. Some come from God, bringing peace, direction, and hope. Others carry fear, confusion, and insecurity. And the most dangerous thing is that, at first, they look the same. Therefore, honoring God requires more than good intentions. It requires vigilance. It requires awareness. It requires realizing that not everything that passes through your mind deserves to remain in it, because thoughts are not neutral. They're always taking you somewhere. And if you don't take control, someone or something will take over for you. That's why understanding this battle changes everything, because when you learn to identify what's going on inside your mind, you start to break cycles that once seemed impossible to break. Is this how God said so? Genesis 3:1. And if in any way you felt that this describes exactly what has been going on inside of you, don't ignore it. Perhaps there is something deeper being awakened now. If this message touched your heart, write in the comments. Amen. Sometimes a simple answer can mark the beginning of a real transformation. If this battle takes place within the mind, then protecting that space becomes the most important decision of your spiritual life. It is no coincidence that Solomon, considered the wisest man who ever lived, left such a direct and urgent instruction to guard the heart above all things. He didn't say, "Take care when you can," or "Watch from time to time." He said about everything, this reveals priority. This reveals that there is something going on inside you that needs to be constantly watched, because it is from there that everything begins to flow. Think about it calmly. Everything you experience today in some way has already crossed your mind. Every reaction, every choice, every feeling, everything was fueled by repeated thoughts over time. And that's where many get lost, because they underestimate the power of constant thinking. An idea that repeats itself is no longer just a possibility and begins to become a conviction. And when it becomes conviction, it starts to direct your life without you realizing it. This is how identities are formed, not overnight, but for what you allow to remain within you. If fearful thoughts become frequent, you begin to act insecure. If thoughts of guilt dominate, you move away, you hide, you feel unworthy. Gradually, without realizing it, the mind creates an internal reality that begins to affect its relationship with God. And here's a profound point. It's not God who turns away. Often, it is the mind that moves away. Because when misaligned thoughts take up space, spiritual sensitivity decreases. What was once clear becomes confusing. God's voice seems more distant, not because he has ceased to speak, but because the internal environment is no longer clean enough to perceive it. Now, imagine the opposite. A mind that is watched, cared for, protected. A mind that does not accept any thought but filters, observes, discerns. Gradually, something begins to change. Peace becomes more constant. The decisions become clearer. God's presence becomes more noticeable. This does not happen by chance. It happens because there is surveillance, there is intention. Guarding the mind is not living in fear of thoughts, it is taking responsibility for them. It's understanding that you can't stop something from trying to come in, but you can decide what remains. And this decision, repeated every day, begins to transform everything around him. Above all that is to be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it come the springs of life. Proverbs 4:23. And if that word has awakened in you a sincere desire to take better care of your mind and hear God's voice more clearly, perhaps this is the time to express it. Write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And if you can, leave your like on this video, because it helps this message to reach other people who are also in need of protecting what happens inside them. There is a deeper level of honor to God that many people have never realized. It's not just in what you do on the outside, in the words you say, or in the attitudes that others can see. It is in what happens inside your mind, in that silent place where no one enters, but where God sees everything. Renewing the mind is not just about improving thoughts or seeking emotional balance. It is a direct act of worship. It is to say, without words, that you choose to align your thinking with God's will, even when it requires effort, discipline, and renunciation. The Apostle Paul understood this in such a profound way that his own life became proof of this transformation. Before, his mind was dominated by wrong convictions, believing that he was doing God's will when in fact he was walking in the opposite direction. But when he had a real encounter with Christ, it wasn't just his outward life that changed, it was his mind that underwent a complete renewal, and this inner change came before any visible impact. This reveals a powerful principle: everything starts within. Many people hope to feel something different and then change their attitudes, but God's way works differently. First, the mind is renewed, then life begins to reflect this transformation. And this renewal does not happen all at once. It is continuous. It's daily. It is a constant choice to reject thoughts that do not come from God and embrace what He says. At first, it may seem difficult because the mind tends to revert to old patterns. But over time, something starts to adjust. And then, without realizing it, you begin to discern better. Situations that previously generated confusion now have clarity. Decisions that seemed complicated become simpler, not because the problems have disappeared, but because your mind is now aligned with the truth. And when that happens, you start living differently, not out of obligation, but out of transformation. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Ephesians 4:23. Perhaps as you listen to this, something within you is being awakened, such as a sincere desire to live this change in a real way. And sometimes a simple step can mark that beginning. If this truth spoke to you in a special way, write in the comments, "My mind belongs to God." It may seem like a small thing, but it is a way of declaring, of making a decision that starts within and gets stronger every day. There is a level of depth in Jesus' teachings that directly confronts what many try to avoid: what happens inside the mind. In the Sermon on the Mount, he did not only talk about visible attitudes, but revealed something that completely changes the way we understand holiness. Jesus made it clear that sin does not begin when someone acts, but when someone feeds a thought. This breaks the idea that it is enough to look correct on the outside, because before God, the invisible has as much weight as the visible. When he says that someone who looks with impure intent has already committed adultery in their heart, he is revealing that imagining, desiring, and cultivating certain thoughts are not neutral things. They are real movements in the spiritual world. This means that the mind is not just a place of passage, but a territory where spiritual decisions are being made all the time. And maybe now it makes sense why certain thoughts seem so intense, so persistent. Because they're not just loose ideas, they have impact. Jesus was not bringing condemnation, but revelation. He was showing that there is a deeper level of relationship with God where purity begins within. And that changes everything, because it is no longer a matter of avoiding external mistakes, but of developing a heart and mind that is aligned with God's will. It is a louder, more demanding calling, but also more transformative. And here's something that few realize. Controlling the mind is not about repressing thoughts, but learning not to feed them. There is a difference between a thought that arises and a thought that remains. The problem is not in what you try to enter, but in what you decide to let stay. Jesus points to that place of decision, where you choose what will grow inside you. This requires awareness, it requires vigilance, it requires a new way of living, where you begin to observe your own thoughts more closely, not to live in fear, but to live in authority. Because when you understand that you can stop a thought before it takes hold, you begin to experience a kind of freedom that once seemed distant, and then, little by little, something begins to change. What once dominated you loses strength. What seemed automatic begins to be controlled, and without realizing it, you are living a deeper level of holiness, not based on appearance, but on real transformation. Whoever looks at a woman with unclean intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart, Matthew 5:28. If you've made it this far, it may not be by chance. There is something being revealed, something that can change the way you view your own mind and your relationship with God, and that's just the beginning. At the end, there is a moment prepared especially for you, a prayer that can strengthen your mind and renew your spiritual strength. Stay until the end, because what comes next may be just what you need to live this transformation fully. There is something that may be happening inside you right now, without you being fully aware of it. Not every thought that arises in your mind comes from God, and this is one of the most ignored points in the spiritual life. Many people believe that everything they think is part of who they are, but the truth is that there are thoughts that come as visitors, trying to establish themselves as residents. And if you don't learn to discern this, you begin to accept as truth that which is actually taking you away from God. Fearful thoughts, for example, often seem protective but actually paralyze. Thoughts of doubt seem prudent, but they weaken faith. Thoughts of guilt may seem humbling, but they are often prisons that prevent you from approaching God with confidence. And most dangerous of all, thoughts that distort the truth, making you believe something God has never said about you. Even great men of God have faced this kind of battle. Elijah, after experiencing one of the greatest miracles in history, defeating the prophets of Baal and seeing fire descend from heaven, found himself in a completely opposite state a short time later. He fled, hid, and went so far as to say, "Enough! Take now, O Lord, my soul." Look at this carefully. A man who had experienced God's power supernaturally was now overwhelmed with thoughts of discouragement, fear, and giving up. What has changed? It wasn't God. It was not the call. That's what he started to feed inside his mind. This shows that no one is immune. No matter how much you've lived with God, if your mind isn't vigilant, wrong thoughts can gain ground. And when they gain space, they begin to distort reality. Elijah was not alone. He was not abandoned. He was not without purpose. But that's exactly what he was feeling. And maybe, on some level, you felt that way too, as if something inside you began to weaken your faith, even when everything around you said otherwise. That is why discernment becomes essential. You need to learn to stop and ask yourself, does this thought come from God? Is this in line with the truth, or is it taking me away from it? Because when you start to identify, you also start to interrupt. And what once freely entered his mind now meets resistance. This is one of the most important steps in honoring God. Not accepting any thought, but filtering, evaluating, and rejecting that which does not carry his voice. Enough. Take now, O Lord, my soul. 1 Kings 19:4. And if this message has opened your eyes in any way, maybe it's time to express it. Declare in the comments, Lord, I receive your teachings. Write it as an act of surrender, as a decision to live with more spiritual awareness, and leave your like so that more people also learn to recognize what comes from God and what needs to be rejected. Now that you begin to realize that not every thought comes from God, an even more important question arises: what to do with those thoughts that are already inside your mind? Because identifying it is just the beginning. True transformation happens when you decide to confront that which does not come from God with something stronger, truer, and more powerful. And this is where many fail, because they only try to ignore bad thoughts, when in fact the path taught by Jesus is different. In the wilderness, after days of fasting, Jesus was directly tempted. And notice a detail that changes everything. The enemy did not come with actions, he came with words. He came with suggestions, with ideas, with thoughts disguised as necessity. If you are the Son of God. This phrase was not just a provocation, it was an attempt to generate doubt, to distort identity, to plant a lie. But Jesus did not argue. He did not argue. He did not go into mental confusion. He responded with something specific, direct, and unwavering: the Word of God. This reveals a powerful spiritual principle. Lies are not overcome with emotional effort, but with truth. It's no use just trying to stop thinking something negative if you don't replace it with something true, because the mind is not empty. If you take away one thought and don't put another in its place, that space ends up being filled again, often by the same thing you tried to avoid. That is why Jesus said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." He was showing that the mind needs to be fed. Just as the body feels hungry, so does the mind. And if it is not fed with the truth, it will feed on anything that comes along. Maybe you've experienced it. A thought of inability arises, telling you that you can't. If you don't react, it grows. But when you replace it with a truth, something changes. When you declare, even without feeling, "God strengthens me, God empowers me, God is with me," this thought begins to lose strength. Not because you have been emotionally convinced, but because the truth has spiritual authority, and this needs to become a habit, not only in times of crisis, but in everyday life. Each time a lie arises, you respond with a truth. Every time a thought tries to drive you away, you bring to mind what God has already declared. Gradually, his mind begins to reorganize. What was once automatic becomes intentional. And without realizing it, you are living something that many seek, but few practice. A mind aligned with the Word. A mind that does not accept anything, but that responds, that takes a stand, that strengthens itself in truth. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. And if this message has already begun to transform the way you see your own thoughts, perhaps this is no coincidence. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You help this truth to reach other people who also need to learn to win this internal battle. Be a part of it and allow this message to continue spreading. There is a profound difference between just reading God's Word and allowing it to enter your mind in a vivid way. Many people read, look at it, even understand what is written, but they continue with the same thoughts, the same doubts, the same internal conflicts. This happens because transformation does not come from speed reading, but from meditation. And meditating is not repeating words automatically. It is absorbing. It is letting it descend from the superficial mind to the deepest part of your interior. When God spoke to Joshua, he didn't give a military strategy first. He didn't teach battle techniques. He didn't talk about physical strength. He gave an instruction that seemed simple but carried an extraordinary power: to keep the mind focused on the Word, day and night. This reveals something essential. Before conquering external territories, Joshua needed to conquer his own mind, because a mind aligned with God becomes firm, stable, unshakable, even in the face of great challenges. And maybe here's a point that changes everything for you. Meditating on the Word is not just thinking about it from time to time, but returning to it constantly, letting it shape your way of looking at life. It's taking a truth and staying in it until it becomes part of you. Until, when faced with a difficulty, your reaction is no longer based on fear, but on what you have internalized. Think about how the mind works on a daily basis. What you repeat, you strengthen. What you revisit, you deepen. Now imagine applying that to the Word of God. Instead of letting random thoughts dominate your mind, you start directing your focus. You choose to remember, to reflect, to declare. And little by little, what once seemed distant begins to become real within you. It is in this process that something powerful happens. The mind that was once unstable begins to find firmness. What once shook you begins to lose strength. Not because the problems have disappeared, but because you are no longer reacting in the same way. There is a different basis supporting your thoughts, and that's what God wanted to teach Joshua, and that's what he wants to teach you right now. True strength is not only in circumstances, but in that which occupies your mind continually. When the word becomes constant within you, it begins to transform not only what you think, but who you are. Let not the book of this law depart from thy mouth, but meditate on it day and night. Joshua 1:8. And as you reflect on it, maybe someone has come to your mind, someone who also needs this peace, this direction, this transformation. If this happened, write that person's name in the comments. Let's present these names before God together, creating a chain of faith where lives begin to be touched in a deep way. There is something powerful that happens when a person decides to take control of their mind intentionally. It's not something automatic. It's not something that happens just because of the desire to change. There is a word that many avoid, but which is essential in this process: discipline. And when it comes to the mind, discipline doesn't mean rigidity. It means direction. It means choosing every day what will remain inside you, even when it would be easier to simply let your thoughts run wild. Daniel is a living example of this. He was taken into an environment completely contrary to his faith, surrounded by influences, pressures, and temptations that could easily shape his way of thinking. But before any outward attitude, the Bible reveals something profound. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. This happened inside him. It was a silent decision, invisible to everyone around, but extremely powerful before God. And this is exactly how mental discipline begins. It doesn't start when you react, it starts when you decide. He decides that certain thoughts will have no space. He decides that his mind will not be shaped by his surroundings, but by the presence of God. And that decision, repeated every day, begins to build something solid within you, because the truth is that intimacy with God does not happen by chance. It is built. And the mind plays a central role in this. A distracted mind, full of noise, hardly perceives the voice of God. But a disciplined mind, which learns to focus, to silence excess, begins to develop spiritual sensitivity. And this sensitivity changes everything. Daniel not only endured, he prospered spiritually in an unfavorable environment. He had visions, interpretations, a connection with God that set him apart from everyone around him. And this did not come from a natural talent, but from an aligned, protected, and directed mind. He did not allow his environment to define his thoughts. He chose who would rule his mind. And maybe here's something that can transform your life. You don't have to wait for circumstances to improve to have peace. You don't need everything around you to be perfect to get closer to God. When your mind is disciplined, your fellowship with God is strengthened regardless of what happens outside. This takes practice. It requires constancy. It requires going back, adjusting, starting over as many times as necessary. But every small effort builds something bigger. Every choice strengthens your connection to God. And little by little, you begin to realize that you are no longer being carried away by thoughts, but leading them. Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself. Daniel 1:8. Nothing happens by chance. If you have come this far, it is because there is something being worked on within you. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared that can further strengthen your mind and your connection with God, and it may be exactly the answer you have been silently seeking. There is a moment in life when the person begins to realize that they no longer need to be lost, trying to decide everything only based on what they see or feel. This moment happens when the mind begins to align with God in such a profound way that it becomes a channel of divine direction. It's not just hearing an external voice, but perceiving an internal conviction that brings clarity even when everything around seems uncertain. That is exactly what happened to Abraham. God did not give him a detailed map. He did not explain every step of the way. He did not show him the complete destination. He just told him to leave. And the most impressive thing was not the order, but the response. Abraham obeyed because something inside him was stronger than any doubt. There was a quiet certainty, a direction that came not from logic, but from a mind sensitive to the voice of God. And here is something that completely transforms the way we live. God still speaks. But the question is not just whether he speaks, it is whether the mind is prepared to discern, because many times the direction has already been given, but it gets lost in the midst of confused thoughts, accumulated fears, and excessive rationalization. The mind begins to question, to create scenarios, to seek guarantees, and without realizing it, he turns away from the simplicity of God's voice. How many times have you felt a clear direction within you, but soon after came thoughts trying to weaken it? Doubts arise, fear appears, logic tries to take over, and what seemed so right begins to dissolve. This happens because the mind, when it is not aligned, becomes a field of conflict between faith and reason. But when the mind is adjusted to the presence of God, something changes. There is a different peace when making decisions. Even without having all the answers, there is a confidence that sustains, not because everything makes sense, but because there is a certainty that does not depend on the circumstances. And that's true divine direction. It's not about understanding everything, it's about trusting the one who is leading. Honoring God at this level takes courage, because many times you will need to go in a direction that is not logical to human eyes. You will need to move forward even when your natural thoughts ask you to step back. And it is exactly at this point that the mind reveals who is in control. When you learn to silence excess and value God's voice above others, your life begins to take a different turn. Decisions are no longer a constant burden and become guided responses. The path may seem challenging, but it is no longer confusing. And your ears will hear the word of him who is behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it, not turn aside to the right hand or to the left." Isaiah 30:21. There are marks that time does not erase by itself, emotional wounds that even after years continue to influence thoughts, reactions, and even the way they see life itself. And the most delicate thing is that these wounds do not remain only in the past, they settle in the mind, creating distorted interpretations of reality. A disappointment can turn into constant distrust. A rejection can generate feelings of inferiority. And without realizing it, the person starts to live not by what God says, but by what these internal marks repeat every day. But there is one point that changes everything. It is not what happened that defines your future. It is what remains inside your mind about what happened. Joseph is one of the strongest proofs of this. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wronged, forgotten. And yet, something inside him remained intact. He did not allow his mind to be dominated by bitterness. He did not entertain thoughts of revenge, nor did he let pain define his identity. Imagine what might have gone through Joseph's mind in each difficult phase. He had every reason to revolt, to question, to give up, but instead he chose to keep his thoughts aligned with something bigger. And this choice made all the difference. Because while many are destroyed on the inside, before any restoration even happens on the outside, Joseph was being prepared internally for what God was yet to do. The healing of the soul begins exactly there. Not when circumstances change, but when thoughts begin to be purified. When you decide not to feed what binds you to the past. When you choose, even in pain, to align your mind with God's purpose. This does not mean ignoring what has happened, but it does mean not allowing it to rule who you are becoming. And there's something powerful about that. Because when the mind begins to be healed, the way of seeing life also changes. What once seemed like just suffering is starting to take on a new meaning. Pain is no longer an endpoint and becomes part of a process. And little by little, the heart finds space for something that seemed impossible, peace. He healeth the brokenhearted, and bindeth up their wounds. Psalms 147:3. And perhaps as you listen to this, there is something inside you that still needs to be healed, something you've never talked about, but it's still present in your thoughts. If this word has come to you in a special way, don't ignore it. It could be God touching exactly that area. If this made sense to you, write in the comments, "I trust in God." May this simple phrase be the beginning of a healing process that begins within and is reflected throughout your life. There is a kind of distance from God that is not caused by a lack of faith, nor by the absence of prayer, but by an excess of noise within the mind. Thoughts that don't stop, worries that accumulate, memories that insist on coming back. All of this creates an inner turmoil that prevents something essential, perceiving God's presence. Because God does not compete with noise, He speaks, but often His voice is so soft that it can only be perceived when there is silence within. Elijah lived exactly that. After intense moments, full of miracles and powerful manifestations, he reached a point of emotional and mental exhaustion. He was tired, overwhelmed, with confused thoughts and mixed feelings. And it was in this state that God decided to reveal Himself, but not in the way many would expect. It was not in the strong wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire. All these events drew attention. They were impactful, but God was not in them. Then something different came, something almost imperceptible to an agitated mind. A still, small voice. And this detail changes everything, because it shows that reconnection with God does not happen in the midst of internal chaos, but at the moment when the mind begins to quiet down. It's not about doing more, it's about silencing more. It's not about speaking louder, it's about listening more deeply. Perhaps you have tried to get closer to God, but you have found it difficult to perceive something real, something that touched you deeply. And often this has nothing to do with God being distant, but with the mind being too full. Thoughts compete with each other, distractions take space, and the most subtle ends up being ignored. The presence of God does not cease to exist, but it ceases to be perceived. Quieting the mind does not mean eliminating all thoughts at once, but learning not to get caught up in them. It's creating moments where you slow down, where you don't react to every idea that comes up, where you allow the inner silence to start showing. And it is in this space that something different happens. A peace begins to emerge without explanation. A clarity begins to form, a presence begins to be felt, and little by little you realize that God has always been there. The difference is that now you can hear it. Now you can feel it. Now there is space, and after the fire, a still small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. If you are here now, it is no accident. There is something being worked on within you, something that can completely change the way you connect with God. Don't leave this video before continuing, because what is yet to be revealed may open your eyes in a way you have never experienced before. There is a sense of urgency that many people have not yet realized. It is not something that is seen with the eyes, nor something that appears in an obvious way in everyday life, but it is real. The battle within the mind has intensified in a silent, constant, almost imperceptible way. Thoughts come and go faster, distractions increase, worries multiply, and without realizing it, the mind becomes more and more vulnerable. Jesus left a warning that crosses time and arrives exactly for this moment. Watch and pray. He didn't say this by chance. He knew that there would be a time when distraction would be one of the greatest weapons against the spiritual life. And watching is not just observing what happens around you, it is paying attention to what happens inside. It is noticing when a thought begins to form, when an idea begins to gain space, when something seemingly small can become an open door, because that's how many get lost. Not all at once, but gradually. A careless thought here, another there. And when they realize it, they are already distant, confused, without direction. It wasn't something big that happened. It was the lack of vigilance in the little things. It was allowing the mind to become unprotected territory. And there is something even deeper in this. When the mind is not watched, it begins to absorb everything around it without filter. Fears, opinions, doubts, influences. Everything finds space. And this directly affects the soul. Peace diminishes, clarity disappears, spiritual sensitivity weakens. Not because God has moved away, but because the mind has been exposed. That is why the urgency is not external, it is internal. It's not about trying to control the world around you, but protecting what happens inside you. To watch the mind is to take care of your own soul. It is understanding that every thought has a weight, every idea has a direction, and every internal choice builds or destroys something. Jesus also said that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This shows that there is within you a desire to get closer to God, to live something deeper, more true. But at the same time, there is a fragility that needs to be recognized. And that is exactly why vigilance becomes essential, not as a burden, but as protection. When you start watching your mind, something changes. You notice faster, react more consciously, prevent certain thoughts from taking root. And that keeps you going, even in difficult times. It keeps you connected, even when everything tries to distract you. Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. Indeed, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Matthew 26:41. And if, upon hearing this, you recognize that God has taken care of you, even in the details, perhaps it is time to express it simply. Write in the comments, Amen. This small word carries a great truth and can be the beginning of a more vigilant and conscious posture in your journey. There is something undeniable when a mind is truly transformed by God. It begins to show up in life clearly. It doesn't take effort to prove. It doesn't take words to convince. The inner change becomes visible in attitudes, choices, and the way we react. And that's one of the strongest signs that someone is honoring God with their mind, because it's not just what you say, it's what you live. Paulo is one of the most impactful examples of this transformation. Before he knew Christ, his mind was completely convinced that he was doing right. He persecuted, arrested, approved persecutions, all believing that he was serving God. This shows something profound. A misaligned mind may seem right, it may seem justifiable, but still be completely outside of God's will. But everything changed when he had a real encounter with Christ. It wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a change in mentality. What used to make sense no longer does. What he defended began to be confronted by the truth. His mind was reprogrammed by something stronger than any previous conviction, the revelation of who Jesus really was. And from that moment on, his life began to reflect this transformation. He didn't just talk about change, he lived. He faced difficulties, persecutions, rejections, but he remained firm, because when the mind is truly renewed, it does not easily return to the previous state. There is a new base, a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing everything. This reveals an essential principle. The most powerful testimony is not what comes out of the mouth. It is what is manifested in life. People may even doubt what you say, but they can't ignore what you live. And when one has one's mind aligned with God, it becomes evident. There is a different peace, a firmness in decisions, a constancy that does not depend on circumstances. Maybe you are looking for this change, wanting to live something truer, deeper, and the key remains the same, to allow God to transform your mind. Because when that happens, the rest starts to line up naturally. Not instantaneously, but really. I am crucified with Christ, and I live no longer I, but Christ lives in me. Galatians 2:20. This word is not for any time, it comes at the right time. And if you're here, there's a bigger reason behind it. Keep going, because what is yet to be revealed can take you to a level of transformation that you have never experienced before. There is a level of intimacy with God that goes beyond specific moments, beyond physical places, beyond external rituals. This is when God's presence ceases to be something you visit and becomes something that dwells in you. And that starts in the mind. Because when the mind is consecrated, separated, intentionally aligned with God, it becomes a prepared space, an environment where His presence is constantly manifested. In the past, the tabernacle was the place where God's presence dwelt. Every detail was carefully prepared, every element had a meaning, everything was organized so that that space was holy. It wasn't just any place, it wasn't just any way. There was a care, a reverence, a separation. And today, this reality has become even more profound because we are not talking about a physical structure, but something inside. The mind can become that place, but for that, it needs to be treated with the same care. Because just as the tabernacle could not be defiled, the mind also needs to be protected. Thoughts are not just passing ideas, they build the internal environment, and that environment defines what you feel, what you perceive, and what you experience spiritually. When the mind is filled with confusion, fear, constant distraction, it's like a disorganized place where there's no room to perceive something deeper. But when the mind begins to be purified, when thoughts are filtered out, when there is intention to hold on to that which is good, something begins to change. Not in a forced way, but naturally. God's presence begins to be perceived more clearly. And this does not happen because you have done something extraordinary, but because you have prepared the environment. Because He decided to take care of what comes in, what remains, what is fed. And little by little, what once seemed distant begins to become closer. Peace becomes more constant. Sensitivity increases. The connection is strengthened. There is something very profound about this. God does not seek perfection. He seeks space. A place where He can dwell, where He is welcomed, where He is not ignored. And the mind, when consecrated, becomes just that. A place where thoughts do not drive away, but bring them closer. Where presence is not interrupted, but cultivated. And when this happens, everything around begins to be affected. Because a mind that carries the presence of God does not react in the same way, does not get lost in the same way, does not get carried away easily. There is a different stability, a peace that does not depend on circumstances. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? 1 Corinthians 3:16. Many people spend their entire lives searching for purpose, trying to understand why they are here, which direction to go, what God really expects of them. But there is a detail that is almost always ignored in this process. Purpose does not begin in the circumstances, it begins in the mind. Before it becomes something visible, before it becomes action, purpose is born as a thought, an idea that arises differently, a restlessness that does not disappear, a vision that insists on returning. Nehemiah lived this in a profound way. He was not initially someone positioned to rebuild walls, nor someone who was at the center of major decisions, but something happened inside him. On hearing about the condition of Jerusalem, his mind was filled with a vision. It wasn't just sadness, it wasn't just worry. It was something deeper, something that came from God. A thought that began to grow, to take shape, to occupy space within him. And notice this carefully. Before any external movement, there was an internal process. Nehemiah did not go out talking, did not make impulsive decisions, did not act out of momentary emotion. He kept it inside himself. He allowed that thought to mature, to become conviction. Because when a thought comes from God, it doesn't disappear with time, it gets stronger. Maybe you've experienced something like this. An idea that seems different, a direction that doesn't make much sense at first, but that keeps coming back, insisting, getting your attention, and many times because they don't understand, the person ignores it. Or worse, it lets other thoughts full of fear and doubt drown out what could be the beginning of something bigger. God's purpose does not come as something ready and completely explained. It starts as a seed inside the mind. And if that seed is not protected, it can be suffocated. Therefore, aligning thoughts with God is essential, because when the mind is distracted or full of noise, it can't sustain what God is trying to build. Nehemiah decided to protect this thought. And from there, everything started to move. Doors opened, resources appeared, strategies were formed. But none of this would have happened if he hadn't valued what started inside him. And I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do in Jerusalem. Nehemiah 2:12. And maybe right now, God is putting something inside of you as well. Something that is not yet clear, but that has already begun. And if this message is making you reflect, maybe it's not by chance. Just as you are being reached now, other people also need this direction. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you help this word to get where it needs to go, becoming part of something bigger that goes beyond this moment. There are times when the mind seems like an impossible place to control. Thoughts pile up, emotions mix, and everything inside you seems to be in conflict at the same time. It's as if a storm is happening inside, even when on the outside everything seems normal. And perhaps the hardest thing in these moments is not what is happening around you, but what is happening inside your own mind. David knew this place well. He wasn't just a king or a warrior, he was someone who faced deep internal battles. There were times when he was surrounded by problems, persecuted, betrayed, pressured. But what most marked his reports was what happened inside him. He talked about the multitude of thoughts, about the anguish, about the emotional weight he carried. And even so, there is something that is repeated in David's story that completely changes the way he sees these situations. He always found a way back to God, not because the thoughts disappeared automatically, but because he knew where to place his mind. Instead of getting lost in the chaos, he chose to remember the promises. He chose to bring to mind what God had already done, what God had already said. This reveals something extremely powerful. God's peace does not depend on the absence of turbulent thoughts, but on the direction you give them. Because chaos may arise, but it does not need to dominate. There is a place of rest that is not external, it is internal. And that place becomes accessible when the mind turns to God, even in the midst of confusion. Maybe you've tried to find peace by trying to solve everything at the same time, trying to organize every thought, trying to understand every detail. But the path that David shows us is different. He didn't try to control everything. He chose to trust. He chose to remember. He chose to direct his mind, even when he didn't have all the answers. And it is in this movement that something begins to change. The intensity of thoughts loses strength. Anxiety decreases. The heart begins to find relief, not because everything has been resolved, but because there is a presence that sustains, a truth that soothes, a promise that remains. The mind that learns to turn to God finds rest, even when everything inside it seems hectic. And this is not something distant or impossible. It is a practice, a choice, a path that begins right where you are right now. In the multitude of my thoughts within me, your consolations refreshed my soul. Psalms 94:19. There is a silent mistake that many people make every day without realizing it, paying attention to thoughts that should never have remained. Not everything that comes to mind deserves space. Not everything needs to be analyzed. Not everything should be taken seriously. But when there is no discernment, the person begins to treat any thought as if it were important. And this opens space for confusion, wear and tear, and even distance from God. Spiritual discernment is what allows us to separate what comes from God from what comes from the flesh or from influences that do not edify. And this does not happen automatically. It is something that is developed with practice, with sensitivity, and with a mind that is already being trained in the truth. Because at first, many thoughts seem convincing. They come with logic, with emotion, with justifications. But not everything that feels right really aligns with God. Solomon understood this in a profound way. When he had the opportunity to ask for anything, he did not ask for riches or power or success. He asked for wisdom. He asked for a mind capable of discernment. And this choice changed everything, because with discernment, he began to see beyond appearances, beyond words, beyond superficial situations. He could judge correctly because his mind was aligned with something bigger. And this is an essential skill for anyone who wants to honor God by controlling the mind. Because without discernment, you become vulnerable. A thought of fear may seem prudent. A thought of doubt may seem cautious. A negative thought may seem realistic. And without realizing it, you begin to feed that which weakens your faith. But when discernment begins to develop, something changes. You start to notice faster. It identifies the origin of thought. He questions what he used to accept automatically, and little by little, it creates an internal filter that protects your mind. This doesn't mean that wrong thoughts won't arise, but it does mean that they won't find room to grow. This spiritual maturity is built over time. It's not about perfection, it's about practice. Each time you choose not to entertain a wrong thought, you strengthen that discernment. Each time you decide to align your mind with the truth, you become more sensitive to God's voice. But solid food is for the perfect, who by reason of custom have their senses trained to discern both good and evil. Hebrews 5:14. And if that message is bringing clarity to something you've been feeling, maybe it's time to declare it. Write in the comments, God takes care of me. Sometimes a simple statement can strengthen what God has already begun to work within you. There is a profound difference between feeling faith and living by faith. Many people associate faith with emotion, with moments of inspiration, with fleeting sensations. But true faith, the one that sustains a lifetime, is not born only in the heart. It is built in the mind. It is a conviction that is established so firmly that it does not depend on what is happening around it. Abraham lived out exactly that level of faith. When God made the promise, everything around said the opposite. Time had passed, circumstances did not help, logic did not support that possibility. Any natural thought would lead to doubt. And this is where the central point lies. Abraham's faith did not ignore reality, but chose not to cling to it. His mind was fixed on what God had said, not on what he was seeing. And this completely changes the way of understanding faith, because it's not about denying the facts, but about deciding which truth will carry more weight within you. Thoughts will always arise, trying to question, trying to weaken, trying to bring insecurity. But when the mind is aligned with the promise, those thoughts don't find room to grow. The Bible says that Abraham did not doubt out of unbelief, but was strengthened in faith. This shows that faith can be strengthened. And that empowerment happens when you choose over and over again to trust what God has said, even when it seems time-consuming, even when it doesn't make immediate sense, even when everything seems silent. The transformed mind does not eliminate challenges, but it changes the way we face them. Instead of being dominated by doubts, she begins to take a firm position. Instead of oscillating all the time, it finds stability. And this does not happen overnight, but is built through daily choices, thoughts that are aligned with the truth. And little by little, something powerful happens inside you. Faith ceases to be something fragile and becomes a solid foundation. What once shook you loses strength. What once generated fear begins to be faced with confidence, not because you feel stronger, but because your mind is grounded in something bigger than any circumstance. And he did not doubt the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God. Romans 4:20. What you're hearing right now can be more than just a message. It can be a turning point in how you live your faith every day. Many people go through this without realizing the value it has. But you're still here. Keep going, because what comes next can reveal something that will further strengthen your mind and your walk with God in a practical and profound way. There is something that the human mind does almost automatically when it is not grounded in something solid. It oscillates. One day he trusts, the next he doubts. One moment she is full of hope, the next she is already overcome by insecurity. And this instability does not happen by chance. It arises when thoughts are based only on what is visible, on what is logical, on what can be controlled. But when something goes outside of that, the mind starts to get lost. That is why God's promises are so essential. They work as an anchor. In the midst of change, uncertainty, and thoughts that come and go, there is something that remains steadfast. Not because circumstances help, but because God's word doesn't change. And when the mind clings to that, it finds stability even when everything around it seems unstable. Sarah experienced the opposite of that for a moment. When she heard the promise, she laughed, not out of disrespect, but because his mind was limited to the natural. She looked at her age, at her reality, at what was possible in human eyes, and concluded that it didn't make sense. And that's exactly where many find themselves today. God speaks, promises, directs, but the mind tries to fit everything into human logic. The problem is not logic, but its limit. Because what God does is not tied to what is predictable, and honoring God requires trusting that. It requires choosing to believe what he said, even when thoughts try to disbelieve, even when everything seems to be going in the opposite direction. When you begin to hold on to God's promises, something changes within you. The mind that once wavered begins to find firmness. What used to generate anxiety begins to lose strength. Not because you have all the answers, but because you have a base, a truth that does not depend on the circumstances. And little by little, this confidence replaces doubt. Not instantaneously, but consistently. Every time a thought tries to lead you to fear, you go back to the promise. Each time insecurity appears, you remember what God has already declared. And this movement, repeated, begins to strengthen your mind. Because in the end, stability doesn't come from control, it comes from trust. It doesn't come from understanding everything, it comes from knowing who you're trusting. And when the mind is anchored in that, it doesn't get lost easily. God is not man, that he should lie, nor son of man, that he should repent. Would he say, and would he not? Or would he speak, and not confirm it? Numbers 23:19. There are times when the mind becomes a heavy place, where thoughts always seem to go in the wrong direction. When circumstances are difficult, when something doesn't go as expected, when losses happen or answers don't arrive, it's natural for the mind to start filling up with questions, insecurities, negative scenarios. And if this is not stopped, this internal environment can turn into a space of quiet despair. Jeremiah lived exactly that. He was surrounded by destruction, seeing his city in ruins, facing a scenario where all seemed lost. There were no outward signs of hope. Everything around confirmed pain, loss, and uncertainty. And for a moment, his mind was affected by this reality. He felt the weight, expressed the anguish, recognized the pain. But something happened that completely changed the direction of his thoughts. He made a decision. It wasn't an automatic change. It wasn't something that happened effortlessly. He said, "I want to bring to mind what can give me hope." Realize this in depth. Hope arose not from what he was seeing, but from what he chose to remember. He decided to direct his mind. Instead of continuing to feed despair, he began to recall God's faithfulness. And this reveals a powerful principle. Hope is not born of visible reality. It is born of choosing to focus on God's character, because circumstances change, but God remains. Situations may be uncertain, but his faithfulness does not change. And when the mind starts clinging to that, something changes inside. This doesn't mean ignoring the pain, pretending nothing is happening, or trying to hide the feelings. Jeremiah did not do that. He acknowledged the pain, but he didn't allow it to define who he was or what he believed. There is a difference between feeling and becoming what you feel. And a renewed mind learns just that. Maybe today you're facing thoughts that try to bring you down, that make everything seem heavier than it really is. But there is a choice before you. Keep feeding these thoughts, or start to bring to mind what can generate hope. It may be a promise, an experience you have already had with God, a truth you know, something that reminds you of who God is. And when you start doing that, even if gradually, the mind starts to change direction. The weight decreases, clarity returns, hope begins to emerge, not because everything has changed outside, but because something has changed inside. I want to bring to mind what can give me hope. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed. Lamentations 3:21-23. And maybe this is an important moment for you. Before moving on, if there is something that has weighed on your mind, something that you need to surrender to God, write your prayer request in the comments. Put into words what is in your heart, because when we come together in faith, something starts to move powerfully, and you don't have to carry it alone. There is an invisible moment that defines everything, but that almost no one notices when it happens. It is the instant when the mind chooses what it will believe. Before any victory appears on the outside, it has already started on the inside. Before any achievement became visible, a quiet decision was made in the mind. And it is exactly at this point that many win or give up. When the spies were sent to observe the promised land, they all saw the same thing. The same place, the same challenges, the same obstacles. There was no difference in external reality. But there was a decisive difference in the way of thinking. While most returned dominated by fear, seeing giants, limitations, and impossibilities, Joshua and Caleb returned with something different inside them. They also saw the challenges. They did not ignore reality, But their minds didn't get caught up in what seemed impossible. They chose to trust in what God had promised. And this choice made all the difference. Because while the others let fear dominate their thoughts, Joshua and Caleb kept their minds aligned with God's truth. And this is where spiritual victory begins. Not when everything improves around you, but when something takes hold within you. When even in the face of difficulties, your mind decides not to surrender to fear. When you choose to trust, even without seeing the result yet. This internal decision is the starting point for everything that comes after. Many people expect to feel safe and then believe, but the path of faith is the opposite. First, you decide to trust, then security begins to form, and that trust is not emotional, it's mental. It is a firm position that you take within yourself, even when thoughts try to take you in another direction. What happened to that group shows something profound. The same situation generated two completely different results, and it all started in the mind. Those who allowed themselves to be dominated by fear never entered into the promise. Not because God has changed, but because their mindset has not sustained the way. Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, persevered because there was something different within them, a way of thinking that was not easily shaken. Maybe today you are facing situations that seem too big, too difficult, too far away. And thoughts may be popping up trying to convince you that it's not possible, but there is a choice before you. Allow those thoughts to set their direction or align your mind with what God has already said, because victory doesn't start when everything goes right. It starts when your mind decides to trust, even when nothing has changed yet. And it is this decision that sustains the path until the promise becomes reality. But my servant Caleb, because there was another spirit in him, and he continued to follow me, I will bring him to the earth. Numbers 14:24. There is a deeper level of mind transformation that goes beyond controlling personal thoughts. This is when the mind stops revolving only around its own concerns and begins to align with the heart of God. At this point, thinking is no longer enough. The mind begins to intercede. And this completely changes the way you live, because you stop being just someone who reacts to life and become someone who influences realities through prayer. Moises lived this intensely. There was a time when the people had gone astray, made wrong decisions, and the consequence of this would be destruction. Humanly speaking, that seemed inevitable. But Moses did something that reveals the true power of a mind aligned with God. He did not accept that reality passively. He positioned himself in prayer. He set his mind before God not for his own benefit, but for the sake of others. And this detail is fundamental. To intercede is to leave the center. It is to stop thinking only about what you feel, what you want, what you need, and start carrying something bigger. It is allowing your thoughts to be guided by God's purpose. And when this happens, prayer ceases to be just words and becomes a spiritual positioning. Moses spoke to God, remembered the promises, appealed to his character. And something surprising happened. The decision was reversed. The destination was changed. This shows that intercession is not something symbolic. It is something real. When the mind stands before God with sincerity, with alignment with faith, it participates in something much greater than one imagines. And perhaps this is a point that few realize. The mind that honors God doesn't just try to protect itself from bad thoughts. It also becomes an active instrument. It begins to generate life through prayer. It begins to sustain other people in thought. He begins to connect with something that goes beyond the individual. It also transforms the way you see your own problems, because when you start interceding, your perspective changes. What seemed so big begins to fit into something bigger. There is a purpose in motion, and you begin to be part of it consciously. And little by little, your mind is no longer just a place of conflict and becomes a place of purpose. A place where thoughts not only affect you, but also bless others. A place where God's presence not only reaches you, but flows through you. Then the Lord repented of the evil which he had said he would do to his people. Exodus 32:14. And if somehow you felt that this message calls you to something deeper, maybe it's no coincidence. There is a purpose being awakened within you. If this spoke to your soul, write in the comments, "God chose me." Sometimes a simple statement reveals a decision that starts within and transforms everything around. There is a way for God to speak that many ignore, not because he is not manifesting, but because the mind is not sensitive enough to perceive. God does not always speak in an obvious way, with grandiose signs or immediate answers. Most of the time, he manifests himself in a subtle way, almost imperceptible to those who are distracted, hurried, or overwhelmed by confused thoughts. And this is exactly where mental sensitivity becomes essential, because perceiving God's signs depends not only on what he does, but on how your mind is positioned to interpret. A closed mind, loaded with doubts and distractions, may even see something happen, but does not recognize it. A sensitive, aligned, attentive mind begins to see meaning where others see coincidence. Gideon lived this very clearly. When God spoke to him, the first reaction was not absolute certainty, but questioning. He wanted confirmation, not because of a lack of faith, but because I knew I needed to be clear. And the most impressive thing is that God did not reject this request. On the contrary, he responded in a specific way, showing that he understands the human heart when it seeks true discernment. This reveals something important. God is not offended by those who seek sincere confirmation, but there is a difference between seeking confirmation and living stuck in doubt. Gideon did not stand still. He moved in the direction of understanding, and this made room for God to manifest himself even more clearly. The mind needs to be open, but also protected, because not everything that seems like a sign really comes from God. That is why sensitivity needs to go hand in hand with discernment. It's not about accepting everything, but about perceiving wisely. When the mind is aligned, it does not rush, but it does not ignore either. Maybe you've experienced times when something seemed more than a coincidence, a word that came at the right time, an unexpected direction, an answer that came in an unusual way. And even so, maybe you doubted, questioned, or let it go. Not because he wasn't God, but because his mind wasn't fully prepared to recognize it. And that's exactly what begins to change when you learn to honor God by controlling your mind. You become more attentive, more sensitive, more aware. Small details start to have meaning, directions start to make sense. And what was previously ignored begins to be clearly perceived. If I have now found favor in your sight, give me a sign that it is you, Lord, who speak with me. Judges 6:17. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and he did not realize that God has already begun to respond in ways that his mind has not yet recognized. Remain until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may open your eyes to signs that have always been before you. There is a detail that many overlook when they think about mind transformation. No one builds their thoughts completely alone. The way you think, react, and interpret life is also influenced by the environment around you, the people you live with, the voices you hear often. And this can be both a source of spiritual strengthening and weakening. The human mind absorbs much more than it realizes. Conversations, attitudes, examples. All this is gradually shaping the way of thinking. Therefore, when someone is surrounded by doubt, negativity, and lack of faith, it is natural for their mind to begin to reflect this. But the opposite is also true. When you are inserted in an environment of faith, something different begins to happen within you. The early Christians understood this in a practical way. They did not live in isolation, each trying to sustain his faith alone. They walked together, shared experiences, prayed for each other, remained united. And this fellowship created an environment where thoughts aligned with God were constantly strengthened. It was not just an encounter, it was a collective construction of faith. This reveals something very profound. Being surrounded by God-seekers strengthens your mind in a way that you couldn't on your own. In moments of weakness, you find support. In moments of doubt, you find direction. In moments of discouragement, you find someone who reminds you of the truth. And that makes all the difference in your journey, because there are days when your own mind may try to lead you down wrong paths. Thoughts arise, feelings confuse, decisions seem difficult. And it is in these moments that the influence of a community of faith becomes essential. It helps you get back on track, to remember who God is, to stand firm even when you feel weak. And at the same time, this also brings a responsibility, because just as you are influenced, you also influence. Your faith can strengthen someone. His words can lift up those who are fallen. Your posture can inspire correct decisions. Communion is not only receiving, it is also contributing. And with one accord enduring all the days in the temple, praising God and falling into the favor of all the people. Acts 2:46-47. And if this message has reached you, perhaps it is a sign that God is directing you to something greater, to a deeper connection, not only with Him, but also with people who share this same faith. If you want to continue receiving messages like this and strengthen your spiritual journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there is still a lot that can transform your mind and your life. There is a quiet moment when everything begins, but it is often ignored or confused. God's call rarely comes in an obvious way at first. It starts as an internal discomfort, a feeling that is difficult to explain, something that does not leave your mind and insists on getting your attention. It's not necessarily an audible voice nor a completely clear direction. It is more like an awakening, an internal movement that asks for a response. Samuel lived exactly that. Still young, with no experience, without fully understanding what was happening, he heard a voice. But at first he did not recognize that he was God. He thought it was someone else, something ordinary, something natural. And this reveals something important. The mind is not always prepared to identify when God is calling. It takes learning, it takes sensitivity, it takes willingness to understand. How many times has something tried to get your attention, but you ignored it because you didn't understand? How many times has a different thought come up, an unexpected direction appeared, but it has been pushed aside because it seems uncertain? God's call often does not impose itself, it invites, and if the mind is not trained, this invitation goes unnoticed. But there is a turning point. When Samuel received guidance, he adjusted his response. The next time he heard it, he said, "Speak, Lord, because your servant hears." This phrase is not just an answer, it is a mental positioning. It is the decision to be attentive, to be available, to recognize that there is something greater happening. And here's what transforms everything. Listening isn't enough. Many people perceive signs, feel directions, even recognize that it may be God. But they do not answer. The call is only complete when there is obedience. And that obedience begins in the mind, in the decision to take seriously what God is showing. Training the mind to recognize God's call is a process. It demands attention, it requires silence, it requires willingness not to discard what seems small. Because often, great directions start simply. A thought that comes back, a restlessness that grows, a conviction that is formed little by little. And when you start taking it seriously, something changes. You start to perceive more clearly, to respond more promptly, to walk with more purpose. Not because everything is fully explained, but because you decided to really listen. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. 1 Samuel 3:10. There is something that can confuse even those who want to do the right thing. The number of voices that go through their minds every day. Thoughts arise from all sides. External opinions influence. Emotions speak loudly. Memories return. And in the midst of all this, there is a silent question that few can answer clearly. How to recognize the voice of God in the midst of so many others. Jesus brought a direct but profound answer. He said his sheep know his voice. This means that it is not just about listening, but about acknowledging. There is a difference between hearing something and knowing exactly where it comes from. And this kind of discernment does not happen by chance. It is built through intimacy, coexistence, a continuous relationship. Think of something simple. When you live with someone for a long time, you recognize that person's voice, even without seeing it. No matter the environment, no matter the noise around, there is a familiarity. And that's exactly how it works with God. The more your mind becomes accustomed to his presence, the easier it becomes to notice when he is speaking. The problem is that many try to recognize God's voice without developing that intimacy. They want quick answers, clear directions, but they don't cultivate the relationship that allows for that discernment. And then, any stronger thought, any more intense emotion can feel like direction. And it is at this point that confusion arises. The mind that is not accustomed to the presence of God becomes vulnerable. It can be influenced by fear, anxiety, external pressures, and all of this can be disguised as direction. But when there is spiritual practice, when there is constancy in the search, something begins to adjust. The mind becomes more sensitive, firmer, more secure. And that doesn't mean there will never be doubts, but it does mean that you won't be easily fooled. There is a peace that accompanies the voice of God, a clarity that does not depend on the situation, a firmness that does not waver easily. And when you start noticing that, something inside you changes. You stop chasing any thought and start discerning more deeply. It begins to filter, to observe, to recognize patterns, and little by little, what was once confusing begins to become clear. Not because the voices have diminished, but because you've learned to identify what really matters. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. John 10:27. Few people will understand the depth of it, but if you're here, there's a reason. God is teaching you something that can completely change the way you make decisions and perceive his direction in your life. Keep going, because what is yet to be revealed can bring you to a level of spiritual clarity that you have never experienced before. There is a very common mistake in the spiritual life that prevents many people from moving forward. Believing that the renewal of the mind is something that happens once and is solved, as if a strong moment, a remarkable experience, a decision made were enough, and everything would stay aligned automatically. But the truth is that the mind, like the body, needs constant nourishment. Without this, it weakens, becomes distracted, and returns to old patterns. God showed this clearly in the wilderness, when the people depended on manna. Food was not stored for weeks or months. He came daily. Each day required a new search, a new dependence, a new attitude. And this wasn't just about physical sustenance, it was a spiritual teaching. It showed that the relationship with God is not sustained in the past, but in the continuous present. The mind works in the same way. It is no use having had a moment of clarity if, in the following days, it is not fed again with the truth. Old thoughts come back, outside influences arise, distractions appear, and little by little, what seemed firm begins to weaken. Not because the transformation was not real, but because it was not sustained. Renewing the mind is a daily process. It's waking up and deciding again who you're going to trust. It is choosing once again what you will allow to enter and remain. It is to return to the presence of God not only when everything is difficult, but as a constant habit, because it is in this constancy that the mind is strengthened. Many want stability, but do not realize that it comes from repetition, not something mechanical, but a living relationship. Each day you expose yourself to the Word, each day you adjust your thoughts, each day you reposition yourself, and over time it stops being an effort and becomes part of who you are. The manna could not be saved for the next day because it's spoiled. This also carries a deep meaning. What God gave you yesterday was enough for yesterday. Today, you need to search again. Not because God has changed, but because He wants ongoing relationship, not dependence on past experiences. And when you understand this, something changes in your way of living. You stop waiting for extraordinary moments to connect with God and start valuing constancy. Small daily moments start to have a profound impact. Your mind is kept aligned, your faith is strengthened, your spiritual perception becomes clearer. Behold, I will rain down bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go forth and reap daily the portion for each day. Exodus 16:4. There is something that cannot be hidden when God really transforms a person from within. It's not an attempt to look different. It's not an effort to convince others. It is something that simply manifests itself. Inner transformation begins in the mind, but is not limited to it. It overflows. It appears in words, in attitudes, in day-to-day decisions. And even if the person doesn't realize it, those around start to notice. Moses lived it literally. After being in the presence of God, something changed in him in a visible way. His face shone. It wasn't something he tried to produce. It wasn't something he controlled. It was a direct consequence of being before God. This reveals a powerful spiritual principle. When one constantly exposes oneself to God's presence, that presence leaves marks. And today, even if it is not something physical as happened to Moses, the effect is still real. When the mind is shaped by God, life begins to reflect this naturally. The way of reacting changes, the way of speaking changes, the choices begin to follow a different pattern, not out of obligation, but because there is something new inside you driving everything. Maybe you've seen it in someone. A person who transmits peace, who is firm in decisions, who is not easily shaken, who carries something different in his eyes, in the way he acts. This does not come from techniques. It does not come from human effort. It comes from a mind that has been transformed by the presence of God. And this also reveals something important. There is no real transformation that remains hidden for long. That which God does within you begins to appear, even in the simplest details. A calmer response where there was irritation before, a wiser decision where there was momentum before, a peace that remains even when everything around seems difficult. Honoring God by controlling the mind leads to just that. It's not just about avoiding wrong thoughts, but about allowing God to shape your thinking in such a way that your life becomes a reflection of Him. And when that happens, you don't have to make an effort to show it. People notice. And this process is not static. He continues. Every day, every choice, every moment in God's presence, something new is added. The transformation is deepening, expanding, becoming more and more evident. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are changed from glory to glory. 2 Corinthians 3:18. And if this message is confirming something inside you, something you have already been feeling or looking for, don't let it go unnoticed. Write in the comments, I trust in God's action. Sometimes declaring this truth is what further strengthens what He has already begun to transform within you. There is a truth that completely changes the way you deal with the mind. You were not created to be dominated by your thoughts. Many people live as if they were hostages of what goes through their heads, reacting to every idea, every emotion, every inner impulse. But the spiritual reality is different. The mind was created to be under the authority of God, and from that to rule, not to be governed. Jesus demonstrated this clearly at various times. There was a time when Peter, with good intentions, tried to stop a path that was part of God's purpose. Humanly, it seemed careful, it seemed like concern, but Jesus didn't just look at the words, he discerned the spiritual origin behind that thought. And his answer was firm, direct, without hesitation. He didn't allow that idea to gain space, even coming from someone close. This reveals something profound. Not every thought that seems good is really aligned with God. And if you don't take authority, you may end up being led by something that in appearance seems right, but in essence takes you away from the purpose. Therefore, honoring God by controlling the mind requires positioning. It's not something passive. It's not just letting thoughts go and waiting for everything to work itself out. There is a time when you need to decide. Decide what stays and what leaves. Decide what you accept and what you reject. And this decision needs to be firm, because insistent thoughts do not shrink from doubt, they shrink from authority. When you start to take a stand, something changes. What used to dominate begins to lose strength. But that authority doesn't come from you alone. It comes from God. It's a delegated authority based on the spiritual truth of who you are in Him. When you understand this, your posture changes. You go from reacting like someone who is trying to survive your own thoughts to acting like someone who has control over your internal environment. This doesn't mean that wrong thoughts won't arise, but it does mean that they won't remain. There is a difference between being attacked and being dominated. And when you take your position, that difference becomes clear. You recognize faster, reject more firmly, and keep your mind aligned with that which comes from God. Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and all the strength of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Luke 10:19. There is a dimension of spiritual life that only becomes accessible when the mind begins to be purified. It's not just about external behavior or avoiding visible mistakes, but about something much deeper, the state of thoughts. Because it is inside the mind that many things are formed even before they appear on the outside. And when this area begins to be treated seriously, something new begins to open up. Jesus declared something that, at first glance, may seem simple, but carries a transforming depth. The pure in heart will see God. This does not speak only of a physical vision, but of spiritual perception. It's about seeing what previously went unnoticed. It's about feeling God's presence more clearly, understanding directions more accurately, perceiving God's action more clearly. Purity of mind is not just a moral issue, it is a spiritual issue. Contaminated thoughts confuse, distort, create noise. They make sensitivity difficult, make everything heavier, more nebulous. But when the mind begins to be cleared, when there is a conscious effort to align thoughts with that which is true, pure, and pleasing to God, something begins to change within. Job is a striking example of this. He faced deep losses, intense pain, moments that could easily corrupt his way of thinking. He could have revolted. He could have entertained thoughts of accusation. He could have lost himself in bitterness. But even in the midst of suffering, he maintained his inner integrity. His mind remained aligned, firm, preserved, and that made all the difference, because purity of mind does not mean absence of difficulties, but it means that even in the face of them, you do not allow your essence to be corrupted. There is a vigilance, a decision not to let wrong thoughts define who you are. When the mind is kept pure, the spiritual eyes begin to open. Things that once seemed confusing now make sense. God's presence becomes more noticeable. There is a different lightness, a clarity that does not depend on the circumstances. And this is not something mystical or distant. It is the result of a mind that has decided to align itself with God in a true way. This process requires attention. It requires daily choices. It requires rejecting what contaminates and valuing what edifies. But each step in that direction strengthens your connection with God. Each aligned thought creates a cleaner, more sensitive, more prepared environment to perceive what he is doing. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:8. There is a place within the mind where anxiety begins to form, and it is almost always linked to the future. Thoughts that have not yet happened, scenarios that do not yet exist, possibilities that the mind creates trying to predict, control, or avoid. And the more these thoughts are repeated, the more they gain strength. The heart races, rest disappears, and the person starts to live as if something bad is already happening, even if everything is still only in the imagination. Jesus brought a teaching that directly confronts this type of thinking. He showed that anxiety is not just an emotional reaction, but the result of a mind that has lost focus on trust in God. And when that trust is restored, something changes from the inside out. It's not that situations disappear, but the way of dealing with them is completely transformed. Martha lived this conflict very clearly. She was busy, worried, trying to solve everything at the same time. His mind was full, agitated, divided between several things, and this generated unrest. Meanwhile, Maria made a different choice. She decided to stop, to focus, to direct her attention to the presence of Jesus. And this choice brought something that Martha was not able to find: peace. This reveals a principle that changes everything. Anxiety is not overcome by trying to control every situation, but by choosing where your mind will remain. When the mind tries to embrace everything at once, it overwhelms itself. But when she learns to focus on God, something begins to calm down. Maybe today your mind is like this, full of worries, trying to anticipate answers, seeking security in something that hasn't happened yet. And this generates a constant weight, a feeling that something is out of place. But there is a different way. It is not ignoring problems, but choosing to trust God above them. Confidence brings rest. Not a rest based on the absence of problems, but on the certainty that God is in control. And this certainty changes the way you think, how you feel, how you react. Gradually, the mind stops racing and begins to quiet down. Do not be anxious about anything, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:6-7. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that could change how you face your internal struggles every day. Stay tuned, because what comes next may be just what you needed to find that peace in a real way. There is a silent weapon that can strengthen your mind in the most difficult moments, but which is often forgotten: spiritual memory. What you choose to remember has direct power over how you face the present, because in the face of challenges, the mind will always look for references. And if she doesn't find memories of faith, she relies on doubts. The people of Israel lived this cycle repeatedly. They saw the sea part, experienced miracles, supernatural provisions, clear interventions of God. But even so, in times of difficulty, they forgot everything they had already experienced, and this forgetfulness weakened them. Doubt returned, fear grew, confidence disappeared. Not because God had failed to act, but because their minds were not sustained by the right memories. This shows that it is not enough to live experiences with God. It is necessary to keep them in the right way. Because when they are not brought to memory, they lose their strength in the present, and this is exactly where many get lost. They live moments in which God responds, acts, transforms. But when a new challenge arises, they act as if they have never seen anything happen. David did the opposite. When he stood up before Goliath, he didn't just look at the giant. He brought to mind what he had already experienced. He remembered the lion, the bear, the times when God had already given victory, and that memory strengthened his mind. He didn't face that empty moment. He faced it sustained by experiences that confirmed who God was. This reveals a powerful principle. The mind that feeds on the right memories becomes steadfast. Because when doubt tries to enter, there is something inside you that answers. When fear appears, the memory brings proof that God has acted before, and that creates a foundation that doesn't shake easily. Maybe today you are facing something that seems too big, and your mind may be focused only on the problem, only on what hasn't happened yet, only on what generates insecurity. But there is a different way. Begin to bring to mind what God has already done in your life. Even if it seems small, even if it was a long time ago, these memories carry strength, because the same God who acted before is still the same today. And when your mind connects with that, something changes inside you. Confidence is starting to return, firmness begins to take hold, and what seemed impossible begins to be faced with another posture. I will remember the works of the Lord. I shall surely remember your wonders of old. Psalms 77:11. There is a decisive moment in a person's life when everything starts to change, but that moment doesn't happen on the outside. It happens inside the mind. It is when someone realizes that they have lost themselves. When you start to question what you are experiencing, what you are accepting, what you are becoming. And that's exactly where the restoration begins. A confused mind always generates a distorted identity. When thoughts are misaligned, the person begins to believe things that do not reflect who they really are. He starts to see himself in a limited way, accepts conditions that he should not accept, lives below what he was called to live. And the most dangerous thing is that, over time, this seems normal. The prodigal son has come to this point. He left his father's house with an idea in his mind, believing he knew what he was doing. But along the way, his choices took him to a completely different place. Your reality changed, your conditions changed, and your mind began to adapt to that situation. He began to live as someone who had no value, as someone who needed to survive with the minimum. But there was a moment when something happened. The Bible says that he came to his senses. That means he woke up. He realized that this was not who he really was. He remembered his father's house, he remembered his origin, he remembered what he had lost. And this memory was not only emotional, it was a change in mentality. This is the point where everything begins to be restored. Not when circumstances change first, but when the mind recognizes the truth. When you understand who you are in God, something repositions itself within you. What once seemed acceptable no longer makes sense. What once seemed impossible is starting to become achievable. Identity aligned with God restores dignity. It takes you out of places where you have settled by mistake. It makes you get up, even after mistakes, even after falls. Because it's not just about what you've done, it's about who you are. And maybe, on some level, you need to live that moment now. Not of condemnation, but of awakening. Realizing that certain thoughts you have been feeding do not reflect the truth about your life. That certain beliefs you accepted did not come from God. When the mind begins to align with this truth, the way back opens up. No matter how far someone has gone, it all starts with this inner decision to acknowledge, to remember, to come back. And he came to himself and said, "How many of my father's hirelings have an abundance of bread, and I perish here of hunger?" Luke 15:17. There is a point in the spiritual walk where everything seems to stall, not because God is not acting, but because the mind begins to resist. And this resistance is not always obvious. Sometimes it comes disguised as logic, reason, questions that seem valid. But deep down, they are preventing something bigger from happening, because many miracles begin with an instruction that makes no sense to the natural mind. Naaman experienced exactly this conflict. He was an important man, respected, accustomed to authority. When he sought healing, he probably expected something great, something worthy of his position. But what he received was a simple, almost disconcerting instruction: dive into the Jordan River. And at that moment, the biggest obstacle was not the disease. It was the thought. His mind reacted. He questioned, rejected, tried to find alternatives that were more logical, more comfortable, more dignified in his own eyes. He almost missed the miracle, not for lack of opportunity, but for internal resistance. Because when the mind doesn't submit, it blocks what God is trying to release. How often does this also happen today? God directs, shows a path, but the mind begins to analyze too much, to question too much, to try to adapt everything to human logic. And in this process, what could generate transformation ends up being postponed or even lost. But when Naaman chose to obey, something changed. It wasn't just a physical action, it was a mental surrender. He gave up the need to understand everything, gave up pride, gave up resistance. And it was at that moment that the supernatural happened. Healing didn't come before obedience, it came after. This reveals an essential principle. The obedient mind paves the way for miracles. It's not about acting without thinking, but about trusting beyond what the mind can explain. It is to recognize that God is not limited to human logic, and that often what he asks for will not make immediate sense. Honoring God at this level requires trust. It requires taking steps even without having all the answers. It requires silencing the need for control and allowing God to lead. And when that happens, something moves, doors open, answers arrive, transformations happen. Perhaps there is something that God has already set before you, a direction, a decision, a step, but your mind is still resisting, and this may be the time to adjust that, because what seems simple can be exactly what will release something extraordinary. Then he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, and his flesh became like the flesh of a child. 2 Kings 5:14. What you are hearing here is not just a reflection, it is an invitation to live something deeper. Continue to the end, because there is a prepared moment that can align your mind in a way that you have never experienced before. There is one part of the spiritual journey that few talk about, but everyone faces: the time between promise and fulfillment. It is in this space that the mind is most tested. Because in the beginning, when God speaks, there is enthusiasm, there is faith, there is expectation. But as time goes by and nothing seems to happen, thoughts begin to change. Doubt tries to enter, discouragement begins to grow, and the mind begins to question whether it will really be fulfilled. Habakkuk faced just such a scenario. He didn't ignore what he was seeing. He didn't pretend that everything was fine. He questioned, sought answers, tried to understand, but there was a moment when he made a decision that changed everything. He chose to wait. Not a passive waiting, but a steadfast, conscious waiting based on the trust that God does not fail. And here's an essential point: perseverance starts in the mind. Before any external attitude, there is an internal decision not to give up. Because time has the power to wear out thoughts. What seemed clear can start to get confusing. What seemed right can start to be questioned. And if the mind is not steady, the person abandons before seeing the result. How many promises are left along the way, not because God has not fulfilled, but because the mind has not sustained the process? Time does not nullify what God has said, but it tests those who are willing to remain believing. And staying is not just about keeping hoping, it's about keeping trusting. Habakkuk understood this. He realized that the vision had a set time. It wasn't in his time, it wasn't at the pace he would have liked, but it was at the right time. And this requires something that goes beyond emotion. It requires constancy. It requires keeping the mind aligned even when everything around seems to be still. Maybe you're exactly at that point right now, between what God said and what hasn't happened yet. And your mind may be being pressured by thoughts that try to make you give up, that try to convince you that it's not worth continuing to believe. But there is a choice before you. Give in to wear and tear or stand firm. Because the persevering mind does not surrender to time. It is based on God's faithfulness. She understands that delay is not absence, that silence is not abandonment, that the process is part of compliance. And this way of thinking sustains you until the moment when everything becomes reality. For the vision is yet to be fulfilled at the appointed time. If it delays, wait for it. Habakkuk 2:3. And if this word found you in the middle of this process, maybe it's not by chance. There is something being strengthened within you now. If you feel you need to renew your faith right now, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Sometimes declaring this is what keeps your mind steady until the promise is fulfilled. After all that has been revealed so far, it is clear that true change does not only happen when we understand, but when we deliver. Because there comes a time when it is no longer enough to reflect, learn, or even recognize what needs to change. It is necessary to put everything before God. The mind that has been taught now needs to surrender. Every thought, every worry, every inner struggle needs to get out of human control and be placed in the hands of the one who can truly transform. The word reminds us in James 1:5, "And if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally." This shows that God not only hears but responds. He does not ignore what you deliver, he acts on what you entrust to him. Now, this is the time to open your heart sincerely, letting go of control, fear, doubts, and allow God to touch you exactly where you need it most. Let's enter into prayer, trusting that He is present and ready to act deeply in your mind and in your life. Beloved Father, your word teaches us that the meditation of our heart can be pleasing before you, and it is with this sincere desire that we now place ourselves in your presence. After all that has been reflected, we understand that true transformation begins within us in what we think, feel, and feed daily. Lord, we thank you for every teaching received so far. Thank you that your truth reaches us even when we are distracted, because your voice keeps speaking even when the mind is agitated. Thank you that the Lord does not give up on us, but works patiently, restoring every area of our life, starting with the mind. At this time, we ask for strength and wisdom. Teach us to govern our thoughts, to reject that which is not of thee, and to embrace thy truth steadfastly. Give us discernment to recognize your voice, courage to obey even when we don't understand, and perseverance to continue steadfast until the fulfillment of each promise. Father, look at every person who is praying right now, he who is mentally weary, who finds rest in thee, he who faces anxiety, let him receive your peace. He who is going through financial difficulties, let him see your provision. He who faces illnesses, let him feel your healing. It restores families, strengthens relationships, brings direction to important decisions, and renews the hope of those who were already discouraged. Now in silence, every heart turns to you. Every hidden thought, every unspoken pain, every deep need is placed before your altar. Receive, Lord, what only you fully know. We commit everything into your hands. Our fears, our doubts, our dreams, and our struggles, we trust that the Lord is in control, even when we don't understand the process. May your will prevail in our minds and in our lives, because we know that it is good, perfect, and pleasant. May your peace, which passeth all understanding, guard our hearts and thoughts in Christ Jesus. May our mind be a place of light, truth, and the constant presence of your Spirit. And that from today on, every thought reflects who the Lord is. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing before your face, O Lord. Psalms 19:14. If this prayer represents what is inside you, write Amen in the comments and present your request as well. May this be a statement of faith and the beginning of a profound transformation in your mind and in your life. Throughout everything we have experienced here, one truth has become clear. Honoring God does not begin in the hands, it begins in the mind. Every thought you feed, every idea you accept, every truth you decide to believe, all of this is shaping your spiritual destiny. It's not about perfection, it's about direction. It's about deciding every day to align your mind with what comes from God, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make immediate sense. This message is for you because God has chosen you to hear it today. Maybe no one sees the battles that take place inside you, but God does. And it is exactly in this invisible place that He wants to act. Now the question that remains is, what are you going to do with the thoughts you have been feeding until today? You're going to keep letting them lead you, or will you take control and surrender your mind to God? I'm very happy to know that you've come this far because it shows that there's something inside of you seeking more from God, and that's already a powerful signal. We are not here by chance. We are together on this journey, growing, learning, and being transformed. I want to invite you to take a simple but important step. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell if you haven't already. But more than that, I want to meet you. Right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you have been facing. Let's create a chain of faith where one strengthens the other because your story matters, and a lot. And it doesn't end there. There is something even deeper waiting for you. In the next video, we're going to dive into an even more intense level about how to live a mind completely aligned with God and experience, in practice, the transformation that many only hear about. Maybe it's just the next step you need to unlock areas of your life that seem stuck for so long. Don't ignore it. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.